Hi Pavan, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Thank you for agreeing to meeting us. Could you tell us a few words about British Humanist Association? What do you do? What are the main challenges you face in Great Britain?
Okay, well, the British Humanist Association, we were formed in 1896, so we've been going for a while. We are a national organisation with around 40,000 members, but a much wider reach in terms of our social media. We have three main departments, which is public affairs and campaigns, which is what I do, ceremonies, and so we offer humanist weddings, funerals, namings, to the general public, and we also have education, which is producing education resources. Now, in terms of the policy and campaigning work that we do in my department, we focus on four main areas: human rights and equalities, secularism, education, and public ethical issues. We've just recently had a new government formed, so in terms of the work that we'll be doing going forward, that's what we're planning at the moment. We have some long-standing campaigns, because as you all know, we have an established church, the Church of England, and we have religious privileges which are afforded to the church. For instance, we are the only democratic country in the world which has bishops in our second chamber influencing our legislature, and so we're obviously opposed to having the 26 bishops in the House of Lords. That's one of our campaigns. We campaign for good quality, fair and inclusive religious education with humanism included on an equal footing as religions, because we know that over 50% of the population in the UK are non-religious, which is why we have so much widespread support. We campaign on assisted dying. We are currently in the process of taking some legal cases. This is one of the few areas where you really do see the influence of the religious lobby in the UK, because they have time and time again blocked legislation in the House of Lords getting through around assisted dying. Obviously, we will make the arguments for personal autonomy and dignity and fairness, whereas they will wade in with arguments which are very much scaremongering about a slippery slope, but mainly around God being able to take life because only God can give life. Other campaigns that we work on obviously free speech, freedom of expression, and we generally monitor the situation that's going on for the non-religious, but we're also obviously huge defenders of freedom of religion or belief. So, you know, with the same hat on, we do defend the rights of religious minorities, particularly in our international work. So we have the International Humanist Ethical Union, IHU, also based at the BHA. And our chief executive is the first vice president, and I'm the vice chair of the European Humanist Federation. So inevitably, we've ended up doing more international campaigning as well. So as well as the work that we do in Westminster, we also work at the European Parliament, and we also have consultative status at the UN Human Rights Council. So we make statements relating to such a wide range of areas, from women's rights, sexual and reproductive rights, again, freedom of expression, the anachronism of blasphemy laws worldwide. But we try to advocate for those people who have no voice, because we understand we're in a very privileged position in order to be able to even speak about these issues where we are. So we try to give voice to those people in countries where it's not so easy to be a non-religious person, whether you self-identify as being a humanist, an atheist, a secularist, or a free thinker.
And what are the results of this advocacy? Does it bring any good, I mean, is it put into life somehow?
We've obviously because we've been going for a long time, what you find obviously with different governments, you have peaks and troughs. So 5 years we get changes in, the next 5 years they're taking the changes out again, depending on who the government is. But recently we've had some really good successes. We've made it so that there was a change in the legislation so that it's illegal for creationism to be taught in any science lessons, whether they're faith schools or non-faith schools. We tend to influence a lot around the policies and structures of the way that faith schools work, making them have to open up their admissions policies so they can't discriminate in terms of their intake. So there might be a Christian school, but that doesn't mean to say that they can only take Christians in the school. I think the bigger successes that we've had there's the sort of obvious ones, repealing the blasphemy laws in Great Britain and helping bring through the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act, and obviously enshrining that into law. But other successes, I think, mainly are in terms of the public awareness of the BHA and the fact that so many people now feel confident to self-identify as humanists. Last Easter, our Prime Minister, who is a Conservative Prime Minister, declared that Britain was a Christian country. And this was a few days before Easter, because he was speaking to an audience of people from the Church of England. And something as simple as going to our patrons and writing an open letter, placing it in a newspaper, basically saying, actually, that's not true. Less than 2% of the population actually regularly attend any sort of religious service, and over half of the population self-declare as non-religious. So it actually creates division when you assert yourself as being from a Christian country. Something as simple as that ran as a news story for a full week across the BBC, across all of the news channels, had widespread coverage across all of the national press. It's interesting to see. Sometimes I think we forget how much influence we do have. So we have lots of distinguished supporters and patrons, so lots of people who are in the media, in the arts, who are scientists, very high profile people who are willing to speak on our behalf. And at the same time, we have an all-party parliamentary group. So we have hundreds of MPs and peers who self-identify as being atheist humanists, who obviously help us with our parliamentary work, and also will speak out when the government or the Prime Minister at the time will make these statements, trying to obviously pander to this more religious minority by making these declarations like, we are a Christian country. This country only has a Christian heritage, and obviously we want there to be an acknowledgement that there's been a huge, wide range of influences on the country and continue to be so. So to single out and to exceptionalise one faith group, we think is really divisive. And I think that we've been really successful in pointing that out. And the UK is the type of country where it's got to the point now, I think it's a bit embarrassing for religious people to admit that they're religious, which obviously is not a good thing. People should be free to assert what they believe. But we certainly don't have the case where people are sort of in the shadows, not wanting to declare themselves as being non-religious.
Is that also true for Muslims? How is the situation with Muslims and ex-Muslims in Great Britain?
Well, it's obviously the Muslim community also is as diverse as any community. But what we have found is that there are sections of the Muslim community who find it difficult to come out as being atheists or freethinkers. Ironically, not so difficult if they're in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, but because there are quite insular, small communities in the UK, it may be a bit more sort of stark if there's one person who's self-identifying as being an atheist. We obviously work with ex-Muslim communities, and if there's a case that someone is feeling like they're persecuted or they have to leave their community, then we obviously will try to do everything that we can do to help. But also, I think sometimes there is a media narrative of around the Muslim community about how they're trying to assert their religious identity. But only recently there was polling done in the Muslim community in the UK, and the vast majority, for instance, of parents said they would not want to send their child to a Muslim school. They wanted their children to be educated in a secular school. So I think that, like I said, there is as many people within the Muslim community who are very secular in their outlook, as there are those who want to have more of a parallel insular community, which isn't so much in accord with the rest of the population. But so they are a very small minority.
Taking into consideration the events related to Charlie Hebdo in France, do you think that there is a problem with criticism of Islam being misunderstood as criticism of Muslim people, and therefore considered some kind of discrimination or racism? what is the situation in Great Britain with criticizing Islam? Is it more difficult to do it than criticizing Christianity? Is there such a phenomenon going on?
There is definitely an element of self-censorship happening by cartoonists, satirists, etc. It's one of these arguments where where the line is drawn, and the way that the people are defining this, like maybe a type of prejudice towards a people as opposed to a belief system. And this is why I don't like to use the term Islamophobia. I think that actually does shut down free speech, because then the implication of that is you can't criticise a belief system. And of course, beliefs don't have rights. People have rights. But what you do find is that you can get anti-Muslim bigotry. And I think that's a much better term, because that can be targeted at individuals. So you can obviously criticise an individual. That's absolutely fine. And if they are trying to justify what they're doing, if we find it disagreeable by their religious worldview, then that's absolutely fine to critique that. But what we certainly shouldn't do is stop our criticisms of a belief system or a structure. Now, Britain has a very long history of free speech and liberty in that sort of respect. And I think that by and large, we find that people don't shy away so much from making these comments. There are obviously people who are on extreme lefts and extreme rights who actually tend to be pretty similar when it comes to these issues. But there are sometimes accusations made of racism and other things. But I think it's really important to make the point that no belief system is beyond critique, and we certainly don't shy away from it. At the BHA, and like I said, I generally think that the press in the UK are quite good at doing this, but of course, like I said, there will always be the critics who come out and say, "Oh no, this is Islamophobic," which is why I think it's a really unhelpful term. But I think we should legitimately look at anti-Muslim bigotry, because that obviously is tied in with racism and rises in maybe hate crime towards communities, particularly visible minorities, and so. These are two very different issues, and the risk sometimes is that the two are conflated. And so, we have to work hard, and we do work hard to make sure that the two are kept separate, so we can legitimately criticise a belief system that we don't agree with, as much as we expect people to criticise our belief systems as well.
You mentioned that it might be easier for atheists or people of secular views who are Indians or Bangladesh origin to come out in their own countries than when they arrive to UK, that it's more difficult for them to come out with their views when they're in small community in Great Britain. So how is the situation of free thinkers in India, for example?
Well, again, India has a very long tradition of free thinkers. Even if you look at, we have an amazing poster in our office of a front cover of The New Humanist, which is a very old publication. And I think it's from 1952. The front cover is with Nehru. And it was obviously the first Prime Minister of a free and democratic India. Now, this is the rich tradition that I'm talking about in terms of the modern history of the country. India has a huge population. So very, very diverse communities, very diverse classes of people, levels of education, all of these sort of different things. So in the same way that you can look at the diversity of a population and their belief systems and their willingness to assert them, if you look at the UK and the majority, say, white population, you just apply that exact same principle to somewhere like India. So there are sections of the community in India where people are more religious, and particularly now there's this reassertion of this Hindu nationalist identity, which I find very dangerous and really distasteful, because I don't think it is actually in keeping with the history and the tradition of India. But at the same time, you have different people at different levels in society who are, said, very much rationalist free thinkers, and we've had, said, many prime ministers who do not assert a religious identity, and they certainly assert their cultural identity depending on which region of India they're from. So, for instance, if I'm from the Punjab, I have far more in common with Pakistani Punjabis who, when the region was split, albeit that they are Muslim, than I would someone from South India, because actually our cultural identity is so much stronger than any religious or belief identity. And I think that there still remains problems in India. Missionaries still go out to India, try and target areas where people are uneducated, more sort of vulnerable or susceptible to their ideas. And so that remains a problem. And there is still this sort of superstitious God worship culture which goes on, which lots of holy people, inverted commas, take advantage of. But there is a real fight back in India as well. And so I love the fact that the Indian rationalists and others will fight back at that, and try to expose these charlatans for what they are, who basically do prey on the uneducated, and on the vulnerable communities that they know that they have a target audience that they can take money from, essentially, which is where it will lead to. But India is as thriving and as diverse as any country. And so you will get the different stratas in society. And obviously not the same as then when you take a small population from a small region in India and then you export them to somewhere in Europe. It's a completely different dynamic. And you could make the same argument for English British communities who move to Spain, for instance, and everyone sort of encloses in one sort of self-segregating in one area. But I'm very hopeful for the future of India. I think that free thinking will win out in the end.
It's much more difficult in case of Pakistan, though, right? How about Bangladesh?
This is all... you can't talk about the situation of, for instance, free thinkers and rationalists in those countries without it being completely intertwined with politics and the political parties. So, for instance, in Bangladesh, we're seeing a huge backlash to secular bloggers, atheist bloggers. Now, that backlash is coming from the Islamist party, who the current governing party are very scared of because they constitute a bloc vote. And so there was a protest in Dhaka where 100,000 people attended, calling for the death of the bloggers. And a list was released of 84 of the bloggers for this one particular publication, Makta Mona, and they have now killed 4 of those individuals very brazenly in broad daylight with machetes and cleavers. So, of course, the situation, and this is a country which has a secular constitution, who, again, this is the country of, it has a very rich and intellectual past and history. Some of the best free thinkers come from those regions, but everything then boils back down to politics and power, and what the government are willing to say openly, despite the fact that the governing party, the family dynasties that rule the country, again come from very secular and dare I say non-religious backgrounds themselves, but they do feel at the behest of the Islamist parties. They don't want to offend them. A similar situation in places like Pakistan, where actually blasphemy laws are being enforced now more than ever because, again, of the government's need and want to try and appease the Islamist fringes within politics. And so they're now coming out against not only the non-religious, but religious minorities. So you're seeing Christian communities persecuted in the same way that you would see non-religious people being targeted and being prosecuted as well. And anyone who has been speaking out, so some amazing, very secular, forward-thinking politicians who have dared to speak out against these Islamists and the agenda that they're pushing the government towards, who've been killed. And so, I mean, that is certainly a way to shut down the debate. When people, exactly, because, I mean, they get what they want and then people operate on a basis of fear, and therefore they stifle anyone who's actually wanting to come out. So the situation is definitely more difficult in Pakistan and Bangladesh. But like I said, you can't just look at the situation in isolation when it comes to religion without actually intertwining it with the political situation of the country as well.
And what would you say globally, what is the biggest problem now that humanists could address, not within Europe only, but around the world?
That is the million-dollar question. There's so many. There is so many. Obviously, with IHU, for instance, we released the report looking at the persecution of atheists, humanists and freethinkers across the world. And the persecution is on the rise. It's never really been documented before in a way that it was in the Freedom of Thought report. And it's still something that is very much under the radar. People don't talk about it. People do talk about religious persecution, persecution of religious minorities. And we also talk about that with our government, and we make interventions at the UN Human Rights Council on behalf of religious minorities as well. But to ask me what the biggest issue the world is facing, we could basically be here all night. But I think that one thing that has come up over the past few days is the issue of migration. And I think that the rise of populist thinking, nationalism, I find really disturbing. And I don't think that it's going to be tackled unless countries particularly countries who have signed up to the Geneva Convention, make a real commitment to actually uphold their duties in terms of taking in migrants, be they refugees, asylum seekers. There are a lot of people fleeing persecution and terrible situations in their home countries. But what to do with these people? This seems to be something that everyone's shying away from, and they're passing the baton on, hoping that some other country will take them in. And I think that this is going to be a problem which just gets increasingly worse. So it's something that has to be addressed. And intertwined with the populism that I was saying, I'm talking about, like, for instance, a far-right party in the UK, the UK Independence Party, who recently got 4 million votes, over 4 million votes in the general election. They were trying to make an argument saying that the UK, we will take in 1,000 Christians from the Arab world, yes, and the Muslims, they can find somewhere else to go. I mean, that kind of statement, that kind of thinking is so dangerous, it's so destructive, and I fear that we will see more of that in the way that we have seen a rise of populist parties and populist thinking, not only in Europe but across the world. I was mentioning the rise of Hindu nationalism in India as well. I mean, it's not something that I've ever seen before, but being in India, in the run-up to the election, and again, seeing people reassert their identity as Hindus, people who have for generations never, except they observed a few cultural practices here and there, but they certainly weren't religious in any sense. But it seems to be creating a very them and us. Well, we're this, and they're this, and they're different, and therefore, for some reason, we're not able to live together. Whereas the reality is, for millennia, people have lived together, whether they're from different religious or racial backgrounds. And so that is a real concern. I think it's going to be an increasing concern as time goes on.
So this is the real challenge to be, well, taken into consideration by the humanists all around the world. I completely agree with you. And the migration, well, it should be somehow faced by European Union in a more organized way and official way, right? Yeah,
oh, definitely. And exactly what we've seen is that European leaders playing politics with people's lives, and that's wrong. And until there is a strong and enforced plan of action where every member state takes on a particular share of that, obviously based upon a country's capacity in order to do it. What we can't do is turn our face from people who are putting their lives in danger, crossing seas to get to somewhere. Like, people don't do that lightly. People don't leave their homeland and their families and their loved ones at great risk to their own lives just because they might want to come to Europe on the off chance it might be a better life. People do that because they're actually fleeing something really serious, and that, you know, they're having to leave their country. And I really think that people need to acknowledge that, as opposed to sort of seeing people as just being chances. You're thinking, I literally don't know anybody who would put themselves in that position. You'd have to be in a really desperate situation in order to take those steps. And I do think that the EU, like on many issues, will be strong in some aspects but weaker in other, and there isn't that sort of cohesion. But I'm hoping that, you know, as governments talk to each other, and so strong statements have been made from the leadership, and I hope, and we will be advocating to the British government to also do their share as well. I hope that we can start to address these issues.
Thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.